Placebo Effect, its Biomedical Foundations, Chapter 2, a lecture by Professor Gershom Zaitchik. In the previous chapter, I demonstrated that the theory of medicine is incomplete, since it cannot explain or understand the placebo effect. It lacks some concepts necessary for explaining it. I shall therefore define two operational metaphors which will illustrate what is missing in the theory of medicine. They were described in another lecture called Wisdom of the Body. The two entities which controls our body are called here mind and wisdom of the body, or VOB. Mind is my consciousness, myself, my will, and VOB are the processes operating in my body, their control, and the entire realm is my absolute unconsciousness. VOB actually has two meanings. It is a set of all processes in the body, and it also is their controlling entity. The two entities are regarded here as a black box with inputs and outputs. I am concerned here mainly with the messages between mind and VOB. For instance, emotions are messages from VOB to mind, imaginations are messages from mind to VOB. Other messages from me to the outside I shall describe in another lecture. So let's return to an example which I gave in the previous lecture. I imagine a tasty steak, which actually is a message to VOB that I intend to eat. VOB mobilizes the entire digestive system, which between meals is usually inactive. For instance, there is an enzyme called pepsin which digests protein, and it is stored in my stomach. And usually the enzyme is between the meals is stored in an inactive form which is called pepsinogen. And my imagination actually activated the pepsinogen and it turned into pepsin. This is what I mean that VOB is preparing my digestive system for a meal. In other words, my imagination participates in a physical-chemical process as a cofactor. It can trigger the change of pepsinogen to pepsin. And what's interesting is that I, or my mind, can activate pepsinogen at my will. Whatever I imagine, I cannot describe. And another person will understand what I mean, but it cannot, or he cannot imagine the same steak that I imagine. Although an observer, here a third person, cannot record my imagined steak, he may still register its effect on the digestive system. Here is a hypothetical bioassay. The observer measures the rate of conversion of my pepsinogen to pepsin. If it is elevated, it's an indicator that I imagine a steak. By asking me to imagine harder and harder, the observer may even work out an imagination dose-response curve. Generally, images sent from mind to VOB elicit observable responses. For instance, if you see my hand raised, this indicates that my mind or my will sent to Wob a message or imagined message to raise my hand. The process of raising my hand is unconscious and it is controlled by Wob. Whenever I will something, I have to convey it to Wob by an imagined message, and Wob will then execute it. Most of my free will is executed by Wob. This relationship between me, or my mind, and Wob was established during my childhood. When I was born, Wob provided me with three instincts: will, curiosity, and imitation, what's called today mirror neurons. I watched my parents standing and decided to do the same. I sent this message to Wob again and again until it enabled me to stand. The knowledge or memory how to stand is embodied in my organism and is unconscious. A newborn is an example of a mindless Wob. As it grows, its mind emerges, and so does its Wob. The adult mind knows that he can stand, but he doesn't know how to stand up. Only Wob knows it, and this knowledge is unconscious. As a child grows, it accumulates conscious mind experiences and unconscious Wob experiences. Let's return to our imagination bioassay that measured the conversion rate of my pepsinogen to pepsin. The observer grabbed my hand and told me in detail about a juicy steak which he had yesterday. Obviously, my pepsinogen conversion rate rose. His story triggered in me, in my mind, an imagined steak, and this message triggered the appropriate Wob response. Pavlov discovered that a similar response may be triggered by the sound of a bell. He fed his dogs with juicy meat and accompanied their meal by a ringing bell. After 2 weeks, he rang the bell without providing meat, and the dog Wob prepared the digestive system in the same way as my Wob upon hearing my friend's story. Pavlov's experiment is called classical conditioning. The dog was presented with two stimuli. The bell was a neutral or unconditioned stimulus, and the meat was an unconditioned response. During training, the two stimuli were paired, creating in the dog's mind an association between them. The bell aroused in the dog an expectation, but did he also imagine the expected meat? Our bioassay does not distinguish between my and the dog's responses, and we may conclude that dog's mind sent an imagined meat message to its Wob. These examples show that Wob may be instructed to trigger the digestive tract by three routes: my imagination, a story that arouses my imagination, and a conditional stimulus like a bell, which arouses my imagination. These messages are conveyed to Wob via the mind. Let's define two things. First of all, what do I mean by instinct? Instinct is an innate Wob faculty. Associative learning is the process by which an element is learned through association with a separate pre-occurring element. Associative learning is an instinct. It operates in all life forms. It is a mechanism by which an amoeba learns the nature of her environment and also operates in us. An amoeba samples messages, signals in its environment. It evaluates each signal whether it is pleasant, which it will seek, or unpleasant, which it will avoid. Both are remembered or embodied in the amoeba. Amoeba will always seek pleasant signals. Rings a bell? Remember, placebo in Latin, I shall please. What medicine described as a placebo is a phenomenon common to all life forms. It is a signal that triggers processes in the body. In this context, the bell sound in Pavlov's experiment is actually a placebo. It is a signal that triggers processes in the body. You may have noticed that I mentioned that a dog has a mind and even imagined as meat. Actually, I introduced silently ideas of a great philosopher, Hans Jonas, who wrote, "The emergence of the human mind does not mark a great divide within nature, but elaborates what is prefigured throughout the life world." According to Darwin, we all originated in one organism and evolved since. All our features and faculties evolved gradually. The primordial forms of our features and faculties appear already in the amoeba. All life forms have a verb, embodied memory, and the instinct of associative learning. Their sensory inputs are coordinated in form of a proto-mind. For instance, the amoeba Fusarium polycephalum is subjected to, when this amoeba is subjected to a series of shocks at regular intervals, it learns the pattern and changes its behavior in anticipation of the next one to come. Or, for instance, another example, conditioning was demonstrated in cockroaches and in Aplysia californica. So, what we call conditioning or placebo are intrinsic attributes of life. In the third chapter, I shall explain how to harness these instincts during therapy.